On a Saturday afternoon in the spring of 2019, a photographer from Chicago named David Shalial stood on Broadway Avenue in downtown Gary, Indiana, and counted the buildings still standing on a single city block. Of the 14 storefronts that had once lined the east side of the street between 5th and 6th Avenue, 11 were boarded shut. 2 had no roofs. One, a former shoe repair shop with a hand-painted sign still legible above its lintel, had a tree growing through its second-story window, the branches pushing out through the shattered glass like arms reaching for daylight. Shalial had been documenting abandoned American cities for the better part of a decade, but Gary still stopped him cold. It was not simply that the buildings were empty, it was that the buildings had been so obviously, so expensively, so deliberately built. The marble facades, the brass door handles, the terracotta cornices designed to impress shoppers who would never come again. This was not a town that had faded. This was a town that had been engineered to be magnificent and then left behind. The story of Gary, Indiana, is the story of what happens when a single corporation builds an entire American city from nothing, designs its streets, digs its sewers, erects its schools, names it after its own chairman, and then, over the course of 6 decades, withdraws the economic oxygen that kept it alive. It is a story about steel and sand and ambition and race and mathematics. And the mathematics are the part that kills you, because they are simple and they are merciless. A city built for 178,000 people now holds 69,000, and the infrastructure does not care who left. The pipes still run, the roads still crack, the bills still come. And 69,000 people are left paying for a city that was built for 2.5 times their number, in a place where the factory that justified the city's existence still stands on the lakefront, still makes steel, but employs fewer than 5,000 workers where it once employed 30,000. That factory is called Gary Works. It stretches for 7 miles along the southern shore of Lake Michigan, a sprawl of blast furnaces and coke ovens and rolling mills that remains, even in its diminished state, one of the largest integrated steel mills on Earth. And to understand how Gary, Indiana came to be, how it rose and how it fell and what it means, you have to go back to the moment when the men who controlled American steel looked at a stretch of empty sand dunes on the Indiana lakeshore and saw not wilderness, but a blank canvas on which to draw a city. The year was 1906. The United States Steel Corporation was 5 years old, formed in 1901 through a merger so enormous that it had required the combined fortunes and wills of 2 of the most powerful men in American history. J.P. Morgan, the financier who had already reorganized railroads and bailed out the United States Treasury, and Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish immigrant who had built the largest steel-making operation in the world and was now ready to sell it. The price Morgan paid for Carnegie Steel was $480 million, roughly $15 billion in today's money, and the corporation that emerged from the deal, United States Steel, controlled 67% of all steel production in the country. It was, at the moment of its creation, the largest corporation the world had ever seen. By 1905, U.S. Steel's existing plants were straining under demand. The nation was building railroads, bridges, skyscrapers, and warships at a pace that seemed to have no ceiling, and the corporation needed a new flagship facility, a mill so large and so modern that it could anchor production for the next half-century. The question was where to build it. The requirements were specific and non-negotiable. The site needed access to Great Lakes shipping, because iron ore came down from Minnesota on ore boats. It needed railroad connections to move finished steel to markets in Chicago, Detroit, and the East Coast. It needed flat land for an enormous plant footprint, and it needed to be far enough from existing cities that U.S. Steel could control the surrounding territory, the housing, the commerce, the civic life, without interference from established municipal governments or competing employers. The site they chose was a stretch of sand dunes and marshland on the southern tip of Lake Michigan, roughly 25 miles southeast of downtown Chicago, in an unincorporated area of Lake County, Indiana. The land was cheap, the location was ideal, the railroad connections were already partially in place, and there was almost nothing there, a handful of scattered homesteads, some scrub oak, miles of pale sand shaped by wind off the lake. It was, from the corporation's perspective, perfect. a place with no history, no politics, no competing interests. A place where U.S. Steel could build not just a factory, but an entire city, from the ground up, according to its own specifications. The man whose name the city would bear was Elbert Henry Gary, chairman of the board of United States Steel Corporation. Judge Gary, he had served briefly on the bench in DuPage County, Illinois, before moving into corporate law, was 60 years old in 1906, a careful, deliberate man who favored dark suits and high collars, and who ran U.S. Steel with a combination of patrician authority and lawyerly caution that his rivals found either admirable or infuriating, depending on how recently he had outmaneuvered them. Gary believed that a corporation had obligations to its workers and its community, or at least he said he believed this, which in the early 20th century amounted to roughly the same thing. He approved the Indiana project. He approved the plans for the city that would surround the mill, and he allowed the city to be named after him, though he never lived there, never maintained a home there, and visited only on ceremonial occasions when the corporation needed its chairman to stand in front of a podium and say encouraging things about the future of American industry. Construction began in 1906 and proceeded at a speed that astonished even the engineers overseeing it. U.S. Steel hired the firm of A.P. Melton to design the city's layout and brought in thousands of construction workers, many of them immigrants from Eastern Europe, who would later become the mill's first employees, to grade the sand, lay the sewers, pave the streets, and erect the buildings. The corporation built everything. It built the residential streets in a grid pattern south of the mill, with numbered avenues running east-west and named streets running north-south. It built a commercial district along Broadway, the main north-south artery, with storefronts designed to house the shops and services that a population of industrial workers would need: grocers, barbers, clothiers, hardware stores, saloons. It built schools. It built churches, or rather, it donated land and provided construction loans so that congregations could build their own, which amounted to the same thing with an extra layer of plausibility. It built a hotel, the Gary Hotel, at the corner of 5th and Broadway, a handsome brick structure where visiting executives could stay when they came to inspect the mill. It built parks. It planted trees along the boulevards, elms and maples that would grow tall enough to shade the sidewalks by the time the city reached its maturity. Gary Works itself, the mill, the reason for the city's existence, was a colossus. The first blast furnace was lit in 1908, and by 1909, the plant was producing steel. The facility occupied a strip of lakefront property that stretched nearly 7 miles from east to west, and its operations included everything needed to turn raw iron ore into finished steel products. Ore yards where the boats from Duluth and Superior unloaded their cargo, blast furnaces that smelted the ore into pig iron, open hearth furnaces that refined the pig iron into steel, rolling mills that shaped the steel into rails and beams and sheets, and finishing facilities that cut and treated the final product. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Standing at the south gate of the plant and looking north toward the lake, a visitor could see nothing but industry in every direction. Smokestacks, gantry cranes, rail lines, cooling towers, mountains of coal and limestone stretching to the horizon. The sound was constant and enormous. The roar of the furnaces, the crash of the rolling mills, the shriek of steam whistles that marked the shift changes, the deep bass rumble of ore cars moving on internal rail lines. At night, the glow from the open hearth furnaces lit the sky orange, and residents of Gary could read the weather of the mill the way farmers read the weather of the sky. A brighter glow meant heavier production, which meant overtime, which meant money. The city incorporated in 1906, held its first election in 1909, and grew with stunning speed. By 1910, the population was 16,000. By 1920, it was 55,000. By 1930, it had reached 100,000. The growth was fed almost entirely by the mill. Men came to Gary because Gary Works was hiring, and Gary Works was almost always hiring, because American demand for steel during the first half of the 20th century was voracious and seemingly inexhaustible. They came from the farms of Indiana and Ohio. They came from the coal towns of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. They came from Poland, Serbia, Croatia, Greece, and Italy, packed into steerage compartments on Atlantic steamships, and then into railroad cars heading west from Ellis Island. And beginning in the 1920s and accelerating through the 1940s and 1950s, they came from the Deep South, black men and women fleeing the sharecropper economy and the terrorism of Jim Crow, part of the Great Migration that would reshape the demographics of every industrial city in the northern United States. Gary in its prime was a city that worked. It was not beautiful in the way that older American cities are beautiful. It lacked the colonial charm of a Boston, the riverfront grandeur of a Cincinnati, the architectural ambition of a Chicago, but it possessed a brute vitality that reflected the industry at its core. The downtown district along Broadway hummed with commercial energy. Department stores like Sears Roebuck and J.C. Penney anchored the shopping district, their plate glass windows displaying the goods that steelworker wages could buy. Washing machines, living room furniture, Sunday suits, bicycles for the children. The Palace Theater, which opened in 1925 at 791 Broadway, was a monument to the aspirations of a working-class city that wanted to be more than a mill town. Designed in a lavish, Moorish revival style, the palace seated 3,500 people and hosted vaudeville acts, motion pictures, and live performances. Its interior was a fantasy of gilded plasterwork and painted ceilings and velvet curtains, a place where a steelworker who had spent 8 hours in front of a blast furnace could sit in a cushioned seat and watch a world that looked nothing like the one he had left at the plant gate. The Gary Symphony Orchestra, founded in the 1940s, performed in the Memorial Auditorium and drew audiences from across the Calumet region. The schools were well funded. Property taxes from Gary Works and the commercial district generated revenue that few comparably sized cities could match. And the Gary public school system was considered among the best in Indiana. The Gary Plan, an innovative educational model developed by Superintendent William Wirt in the 1910s and 1920s, attracted national attention for its approach to integrating academic instruction with vocational training and physical activity. Schools across the country studied and copied the Gary Plan, and Wirt became one of the most prominent educators in the United States, invited to consult for school districts from New York to California. At its peak, which most historians place somewhere in the decade between 1955 and 1965, Gary was home to roughly 178,000 people, making it the fifth largest city in Indiana and the second largest in the northwest corner of the state. Gary Works employed approximately 30,000 workers across its various divisions, and the wages those workers earned radiated outward through the local economy in a classic multiplier effect. Steelworker paychecks paid for houses, and the houses needed plumbers, electricians, roofers, and painters. Steelworker families bought groceries, and the grocery stores hired clerks and stock boys and delivery drivers. Steelworker children attended schools, and the schools hired teachers and administrators and janitors. The entire economic ecosystem of Gary, Indiana, from the doctor's office on Fifth Avenue to the bar on Washington Street to the car dealership on Broadway, existed because Gary Works existed, and everyone in the city understood this relationship with a clarity that required no economic training to grasp. The mill was the city was the mill. The two were the same organism. The Jackson family moved to Gary from Arkansas in the 1950s, settling into a small house at 2300 Jackson Street, a coincidence of naming that would later seem almost too perfect. Joseph Jackson, the patriarch, worked at U.S. Steel's Gary Works as a crane operator, and it was in that small house, in the evenings after his shift, that he began training his sons to sing and dance and play instruments. The group that emerged, first as the Jackson Brothers, then as the Jackson Five, would become one of the most successful musical acts of the 20th century, and their youngest member, Michael, would become the most famous entertainer in the world. The Jackson Five's story is inseparable from Gary's story, because it was Gary's particular combination of industrial wages and working-class striving that created the conditions for the family's ambition. Joe Jackson could afford a house and instruments because the mill paid well. He pushed his sons with ferocious intensity because he had seen what the alternative looked like, a lifetime of shift work in a steel plant, and he wanted something different for them. The house on Jackson Street still stands. It is now a pilgrimage site for fans from around the world, one of the few addresses in Gary that still draws visitors, a small wooden structure in a neighborhood where many of the surrounding houses are gone. The wages at Gary Works were, by the standards of mid-century American industrial labor, exceptionally good. A steelworker in the 1950s and 1960s, particularly one with seniority and a skilled classification, could earn enough to own a home, buy a car, take annual vacations, and send children to college, the full suite of post-war American middle-class life. The United Steelworkers of America, the union that represented Gary Works employees, had negotiated contracts that included health insurance, pensions, paid holidays, and overtime provisions that made a mill job one of the best compensated forms of manual labor available anywhere in the country. A man without a college degree could walk into Gary Works at 18, work for 30 years, and retire with a pension that would sustain him for the rest of his life. This was not an abstraction. This was the lived reality of tens of thousands of families in Gary, and it produced a standard of living that gave the city its particular character. Proud, solid, and deeply aware that everything it had came from the mill. The racial composition of Gary shifted dramatically during these peak years, and the shift carried consequences that would define the city's future. The Great Migration brought tens of thousands of black families to Gary between the 1920s and the 1960s, drawn by the same promise that drew everyone else: good wages at the mill. But Gary, like every northern industrial city, was segregated. Black workers could get jobs at the mill, but they were concentrated in the most dangerous and least desirable positions: the coke ovens, the blast furnace floors, the sintering plants where temperatures routinely exceeded 140 degrees. Housing was divided along racial lines enforced by restrictive covenants, redlining, and the blunt threat of white violence. Black families were confined to the central and southern sections of the city, while white families occupied the more desirable neighborhoods to the north and west, closer to the lake. By 1960, Gary's population was roughly 53% black, and the white population had already begun to leave. The pattern was identical to what was happening in Detroit, Cleveland, Newark, and a dozen other northern cities. As black residents moved into previously white neighborhoods, white residents moved out, relocating to the suburbs of Maryville, Hobart, Crown Point, and Portage that ringed Gary to the south and west. The phenomenon was called white flight, and in Gary it was accelerated by the particular intensity of the city's racial divisions and by a political event that, in 1967, made national headlines. Richard Gordon Hatcher won the mayoral election in Gary on November 7, 1967, becoming one of the first black mayors of a major American city. He was 34 years old, a lawyer and civil rights activist who had grown up in Michigan City, Indiana, and moved to Gary to practice law in 1959. His campaign was a grassroots operation built on voter registration drives in black neighborhoods and a message of economic justice and political empowerment that galvanized Gary's black community. The Democratic Party machine, which had controlled Gary's politics for decades, opposed him. The local party chairman, John Krupa, ran a write-in campaign to stop him, and there were credible allegations that the machine attempted to manipulate voter rolls in white precincts to suppress Hatcher's margin. He won anyway, by a margin of roughly 1,500 votes, and his victory was covered by newspapers and television networks across the country as a landmark in American racial politics. Hatcher's election was both a triumph and a catalyst. For Gary's black residents, who now constituted a clear majority of the city's population, it represented a long overdue transfer of political power. For many of Gary's remaining white residents, it was the final signal to leave. The white exodus from Gary, which had been underway since the late 1950s, accelerated sharply after 1967. Entire neighborhoods on the city's north and west sides emptied within a decade. The families who left took their tax base with them. They took their purchasing power. They took their children out of the Gary public schools and enrolled them in suburban districts. And they took, in many cases, the small businesses they had operated, the bakeries, the hardware stores, the dental practices, the insurance agencies that had filled the storefronts along Broadway and the commercial strips in the residential neighborhoods. But white flight alone did not kill Gary. What killed Gary was steel. The American steel industry entered a period of contraction in the late 1960s that would prove to be not a temporary downturn, but a permanent structural decline. The causes were multiple and reinforcing. Japanese steelmakers, rebuilding from the rubble of World War II with brand new plants designed around the latest technology, began producing high-quality steel at prices American mills could not match. German and Korean producers followed. The American industry, which had not significantly modernized its plants since the 1940s and 1950s, found itself competing with facilities that were newer, more efficient, and cheaper to operate. At the same time, a new type of domestic competitor emerged, the mini-mill. Companies like Nucor and Chaparral Steel built small, nimble plants that used electric arc furnaces to melt scrap steel and reshape it into finished products. Mini-mills required a fraction of the workforce and capital investment of a traditional integrated mill like Gary Works, and they could produce many steel products, rods, bars, structural shapes, at significantly lower cost. They could not produce the high-end, flat-rolled steel that was Gary Works' specialty, but they devoured the market for simpler products that had once provided steady volume for the big mills. Automation compounded the damage. Even as Gary Works maintained production volumes that, in absolute terms, remained substantial, the number of workers needed to produce each ton of steel declined relentlessly. Processes that had once required dozens of men, feeding the furnaces, monitoring the rolling mills, operating the cranes, were increasingly handled by computerized controls and mechanical systems that needed only a handful of operators. The productivity gains were real and significant. They were also devastating to a city whose entire economy rested on the assumption that making steel required tens of thousands of human beings. The layoffs began in the 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s. U.S. Steel, which renamed itself USX Corporation in 1986 in a symbolic acknowledgement that it was no longer solely a steel company, reduced the workforce at Gary Works in waves. Each round of layoffs sent a shudder through the local economy. A steel worker who lost his job at Gary Works did not simply lose a paycheck. He lost his health insurance, his pension accrual, his identity as a provider. And when he stopped spending money at the grocery store and the car dealership and the department store, those businesses lost revenue. And when enough revenue was lost, they closed. And when they closed, their employees lost their jobs too. And the cycle repeated at a lower level of the economic food chain. The multiplier effect that had amplified Gary's prosperity now worked in reverse, amplifying its decline with the same mathematical precision. Between 1970 and 1990, Gary lost more than 50,000 residents. The population, which had peaked at 178,000 in 1960, fell to 151,000 in 1970, 116,000 in 1980, and 116,000 again in 1990, a plateau that reflected not stability, but the fact that many of the people who remained had nowhere else to go. They were too old, too poor, too deeply rooted, or too stubbornly attached to the city they had known to leave. They stayed while the city emptied around them. The physical evidence of the decline accumulated with a speed that seemed almost geological in its finality. Houses emptied and were not reoccupied. Commercial buildings closed and were not reopened. The once grand storefronts along Broadway stood vacant, their windows first boarded, then broken, then open to the weather. The Palace Theater, where 3,500 people had once watched movies and live shows, closed in the 1970s, and its interior, the gilded plasterwork, the painted ceilings, the velvet curtains, decayed in the darkness behind its locked doors. The Gary Hotel closed. The department stores closed. The banks moved to the suburbs. The churches that U.S. Steel had helped build emptied as their congregations scattered, and their buildings, too, joined the growing inventory of architectural corpses that lined the city's streets. The Methodist Church on West 6th Avenue, became one of the most photographed abandoned buildings in America. A massive stone structure with Gothic arches and a bell tower. Its roof collapsed, its interior open to the sky, trees and vegetation growing in what had been the nave. Photographers and urban explorers traveled from around the country to stand inside the ruined church and take pictures that appeared on websites and in magazines and on social media feeds, where they served as shorthand for a particular kind of American failure. The irony was bitter. The building that had been built to serve a community was now more famous as a ruin than it had ever been as a functioning church, and the attention it attracted brought visitors to Gary who spent money nowhere, contributed nothing to the tax base, and left with images that reinforced the city's reputation as a place that had already died. The numbers tell the story with a bluntness that narrative cannot soften. In 2015, the city of Gary conducted a comprehensive survey of its building stock in partnership with the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. The results were staggering. The survey identified 6,315 abandoned residential structures within the city limits. It counted 554 vacant commercial and industrial buildings. It cataloged approximately 13,000 blighted properties, a category that included not only abandoned buildings, but also vacant lots where structures had already been demolished, leaving behind foundations, overgrown lawns, and the occasional set of concrete front steps leading up to nothing. In total, the survey found that roughly 1/3 of all properties in Gary were either abandoned, vacant, or blighted. 1/3. In a city of 69,000 people, 1 out of every 3 properties had been given up on. Gary Works, the mill that had created the city, continued to operate throughout the decline. This distinguished Gary from many other company towns in the City Fall series. In Port St. Joe, the mill closed entirely. In Scotia, the mine shut down. Gary Works survived, but it survived in a form that was almost crueler than closure, because it demonstrated exactly how few workers a modern steel mill actually needs. The workforce, which had peaked at approximately 30,000 in the 1950s and 1960s, fell to roughly 20,000 in the 1970s, 15,000 in the 1980s, 8,000 in the 1990s, and approximately 5,000 by the 2010s. 5,000 workers in a facility that had once employed 30,000. The mill still made steel. The blast furnaces still glowed at night. The ore boats still docked at the lakefront. But the vast majority of the jobs, 25,000 of them, had simply disappeared, eliminated by automation, by efficiency improvements, by the relentless economic logic that says if you can produce the same output with fewer workers, you must, because your competitors will. The cascade effects of the workforce reduction were catastrophic for the city. 30,000 steelworker salaries had generated tax revenue sufficient to maintain a city of 178,000 people. The roads, the sewers, the water system, the fire stations, the police department, the schools, the parks, the streetlights, the garbage collection. 5,000 steelworker salaries could not. The arithmetic was unyielding. The city's infrastructure had been designed and built for a population of nearly 180,000. The sewers ran under streets where no one lived anymore. The water mains served blocks where every house was boarded up. The roads connected neighborhoods that had become urban prairies, open fields of tall grass where houses had once stood, bordered by sidewalks that led to nothing. The city was paying to maintain the physical plant of a metropolis while collecting the tax revenue of a small town. And the gap between what it needed to spend and what it could collect grew wider every year. The school system contracted in parallel with the population. Gary had once operated dozens of schools across the city, a comprehensive system that served tens of thousands of students and employed thousands of teachers and staff. By the 2000s, the district had closed more than half its buildings. Theodore Roosevelt High School, Horace Mann High School, Wirt High School, schools whose names evoked the city's civic ambitions, shut their doors one after another as enrollment declined below viable levels. The remaining schools operated with reduced budgets, reduced staff, and reduced expectations, serving a student population that was overwhelmingly poor in a city where the poverty rate exceeded 35%. The physical collapse of the school buildings mirrored the collapse of everything else. Closed schools, like closed stores and closed churches, became targets for scrap metal thieves who stripped the buildings of their copper wiring, plumbing fixtures, and aluminum window frames. The theft accelerated the deterioration. Buildings that might have stood empty but intact for decades instead fell into ruin within years, their interiors gutted, their roofs compromised by missing flashing, their basements flooded by broken pipes. The cost of demolishing these structures, which the city was often required to do for public safety reasons, further strained a municipal budget that was already stretched beyond its limits. Crime filled the vacuum left by employment. Gary's murder rate, which had been high since the 1970s, spiked in the 1990s and 2000s to levels that placed the city consistently among the most dangerous in the United States on a per capita basis. In 2003, the FBI's Uniform Crime Report ranked Gary as the murder capital of America, with a homicide rate of approximately 63 per 100,000 residents. The distinction was not an anomaly. Year after year, Gary appeared near the top of national lists of violent crime, a statistical reflection of the conditions that produce violence everywhere they are found: concentrated poverty, high unemployment, inadequate public services, and a population of young men with limited, legitimate economic prospects. The Hatcher administration, which lasted from 1968 to 1987, 5 terms, 20 years, struggled throughout its tenure with the contradictions of governing a city whose economic foundation was eroding. Hatcher was a skilled politician and a committed public servant who brought federal dollars to Gary, built public housing, and attempted to diversify the city's economy away from its dependence on steel. But the forces working against him were larger than any single mayor could overcome. He could not stop the layoffs at Gary Works. He could not compel white families to return. He could not force the suburban municipalities that had absorbed Gary's white population to share their tax revenue with the city those residents had abandoned. He left office in 1987 with Gary diminished but still functioning. The mayors who followed him, Thomas Barnes, Scott King, Karen Freeman Wilson, Jerome Prince, inherited a city in progressively worse condition and governed with progressively fewer resources. The 21st century brought scattered attempts at recovery, none of them sufficient to reverse the trajectory. The Gary Land Bank, established to acquire and manage the city's vast inventory of tax-delinquent and abandoned properties, worked methodically to clear blighted structures and assemble parcels of vacant land that might attract future development. The demolition campaigns were necessary and visible, cranes and wrecking balls knocking down buildings that had become hazards, clearing blocks that had become dumping grounds, but they also produced a strange and disquieting visual effect. Neighborhoods that had been blighted but recognizably urban became, after demolition, something else entirely. Open fields within the city grid, blocks of grass and weeds bounded by curbs and sidewalks, a cityscape being slowly erased back to the prairie it had been before U.S. Steel arrived. The Indiana legislature authorized the creation of the Gary Redevelopment Commission, which pursued a strategy of targeted investment in a handful of corridors and anchor projects. The most visible of these was the redevelopment of the area around the Gary/Chicago International Airport, a small commercial airport on the city's western edge that civic leaders hoped could attract cargo operations and related businesses. The airport received runway improvements and a new terminal building, but the anticipated economic ripple effects were slow to materialize. An Amazon distribution center opened nearby, bringing several hundred jobs. But several hundred jobs in a city that had lost 25,000 at a single plant did not register as transformation. The Marquette Plan, developed in partnership with regional planning agencies, proposed a long-term vision for Gary's lakefront that would reclaim industrial land for parks, residential development, and mixed-use commercial space. The Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which Congress had designated in 1966 to preserve the sand dunes and wetlands along the Lake Michigan shoreline in Porter and Lake counties, had already demonstrated that the natural environment east of Gary could attract visitors and investment. The Marquette Plan imagined extending that success westward, creating a continuous lakefront amenity that might give Gary the kind of waterfront asset that had driven revitalization in cities like Cleveland and Milwaukee. But the plan required cooperation between the city, U.S. Steel, which owned much of the lakefront, the National Park Service, and multiple state and federal agencies, and progress was measured in years and decades rather than months. Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson, who took office in 2014, launched an aggressive demolition and stabilization program, securing state and federal funds to tear down hundreds of abandoned structures annually. Her administration also pursued a strategy of consolidating the city's remaining population into viable neighborhoods, a concept sometimes called smart shrinkage or right-sizing, that acknowledged the reality that Gary would not return to its peak population, and that the most practical path forward was to concentrate services and investment in areas where people still lived, rather than spreading diminishing resources across the entire 57-square-mile footprint of a city designed for 3 times its current population. The Hard Rock Casino, which opened in 2021, after years of political negotiation and regulatory approval, represented the largest single private investment in Gary in decades. The casino and its associated hotel and entertainment complex were built on the city's lakefront, on land that had once been part of the Gary Works industrial footprint, and they brought several hundred permanent jobs and a stream of gaming tax revenue to the city treasury. Advocates of the project argued that the casino could serve as a catalyst for broader lakefront development. Skeptics pointed out that casino-driven revitalization had been promised in Atlantic City, in Detroit, in countless struggling cities, and that the track record was mixed at best. Gary's proximity to Chicago, the city sits just 25 miles from the Loop, connected by interstate highways and the South Shore commuter rail line, has been both a source of hope and a source of frustration for decades. In theory, a city 25 miles from one of the largest metropolitan economies in the world should be able to attract spillover investment, commuters seeking affordable housing, and businesses looking for cheaper real estate. In practice, Gary's reputation, its crime statistics, its battered infrastructure, and the simple visual reality of its thousands of abandoned buildings have made it difficult to attract the kind of middle-class residents and commercial tenants who drive urban recovery. The South Shore Line carries commuters between Gary and Chicago's Millennium Station daily, but the commuters are few, and the development around Gary's stations has been minimal. There are, to be fair, signs of life. Small-scale developers have renovated individual buildings in the downtown area, converting them into apartments and offices. Artists and entrepreneurs, drawn by rock-bottom real estate prices and the raw visual drama of the city's empty spaces, have established studios, galleries, and small businesses in buildings that might otherwise have been demolished. The Art House, a social enterprise founded by artist Theaster Gates, has worked to convert vacant properties into community spaces and cultural venues. These efforts are real, and they matter to the people involved in them, but they exist at a scale that is dwarfed by the scale of the problem. Renovating 10 buildings in a city with 6,315 abandoned houses is not recovery. It is a gesture, sincere and admirable, in the direction of recovery. What Gary, Indiana represents, what it teaches, what it warns, is something that transcends the specific history of one city and one steel mill. It is a lesson about the relationship between a place and the economic activity that sustains it, and about what happens when that activity is controlled by a single entity whose obligations to the place are, in the end, contractual rather than existential. U.S. Steel did not destroy Gary out of malice. The corporation did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon the city it had built. What happened was at once more mundane and more devastating than deliberate cruelty. U.S. Steel responded to market conditions. It reduced its workforce because technology allowed it to produce steel with fewer workers, and because global competition required it to reduce costs or die. It invested in automation because automation improved efficiency. It maintained Gary Works as a functioning mill because the facility, despite its age, still possessed advantages. Its location on the Great Lakes shipping network, its scale, its existing infrastructure, that made it economically viable even in a diminished industry. The corporation did what corporations do. It optimized. But the city could not optimize. A city is not a corporation. It cannot lay off its residents. It cannot close its least productive neighborhoods and consolidate operations into its most efficient ones, not without the kind of wrenching social upheaval that Mayor Freeman Wilson's right-sizing efforts only began to attempt. A city cannot reduce its infrastructure to match its reduced population, because the sewers are in the ground, and the roads are paved, and the water mains are buried, and the cost of removing them exceeds the cost of maintaining them, and so the city maintains infrastructure it cannot afford for a population that no longer exists, paying the bills with revenue generated by the population that remains. This is the math problem that sits at the center of Gary's story, and it is a math problem that has no good solution. Gary's infrastructure was designed and built to serve 178,000 people. The sewage treatment plant was sized for 178,000 people. The water distribution system was engineered for 178,000 people. The roads were paved to carry the traffic of 178,000 people. The fire stations were positioned to protect the homes and businesses of 178,000 people. Today, 69,000 people live in Gary, and they are responsible for maintaining all of it. The per capita cost of basic city services, water, sewer, roads, police, fire, garbage collection, is, as a mathematical certainty, roughly 2.5 times what it would be if the city were the right size for its population. Every resident of Gary pays, through taxes and fees and diminished services, the price of being a 69,000-person city living in a 178,000-person body. The phenomenon is not unique to Gary. Economists and urban planners call it the legacy city problem, and it afflicts dozens of former industrial cities across the American Midwest and Northeast. Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, Flint, East St. Louis, Camden. These cities share a common biography. They were built by industry, swelled by immigration and migration, peaked in the mid-20th century, and then declined when the industries that created them mechanized, moved, or died. They are all trapped in the same arithmetic: infrastructure built for populations they no longer have, maintained by populations that cannot afford the cost. And they all face the same cruel irony. The very quality that made them prosperous, their total dependence on a single industry or a single employer, is the quality that made their decline so catastrophic. A diversified economy absorbs the loss of a single employer. A company town does not. A company town is a bet, and when the bet goes bad, there is no hedge. Judge Elbert H. Gary died in 1927, 21 years after the city that bore his name was founded. He died wealthy and honored at his home in New York City, having served as chairman of U.S. Steel for its first quarter-century. He never lived in Gary, Indiana. He never experienced the city as a resident, never walked its streets as a neighbor, never sent his children to its schools or worshipped in its churches or bought his groceries from its stores. The city was named for him as a gesture of corporate vanity, the way a building or a scholarship or a hospital wing is named for a benefactor, and the name stuck because names do. Today, 120 years after its founding, the city of Gary, Indiana still bears the name of a man who never called it home, a man whose connection to the place was purely administrative and whose legacy there is measured not in the things he built, but in the gap between what was built and what remains. The Jackson family's house at 2300 Jackson Street still stands, a small two-story structure painted white, now enclosed by a metal fence that the city installed to manage the flow of visitors. Fans still come from Japan, from Germany, from Brazil, from every corner of the world to stand in front of the house where Michael Jackson spent his childhood, to take photographs, to leave flowers and notes and small gifts along the fence. The house is one of the few buildings in its neighborhood that is consistently maintained. On the surrounding blocks, the pattern of abandonment is advanced. Empty lots where houses once stood, remaining structures with boarded windows and sagging porches, sidewalks cracked and heaved by tree roots and frost cycles, and the simple passage of time without repair. The contrast between the pilgrimage site and its surroundings is striking and sad, a single point of light in a darkened grid. Gary Works still operates. The blast furnaces still glow at night, though fewer of them than before. The ore boats still come down from the iron ranges of Minnesota and dock at the lakefront, though fewer of them than before. Approximately 5,000 workers still pass through the plant gates each day, still make steel, still earn wages that are, by Gary's diminished standards, good. The mill is still one of the largest integrated steel facilities in the Western Hemisphere, and it still produces millions of tons of flat-rolled steel annually, the kind of steel that goes into automobiles and appliances and construction materials. U.S. Steel, which resumed its original name after a corporate restructuring, still owns the plant and still lists it as a core asset. The mill survives. The city around it is a different question. On a Saturday afternoon in 2019, David Shalial, the photographer from Chicago, finished his count of the buildings on that block of Broadway Avenue and walked south toward the old commercial district. He passed the Palace Theater, still standing, still closed, its Moorish arches still visible above the boarded entrance. He passed the site of the Gary Hotel, demolished years earlier, now a vacant lot surrounded by a chain-link fence. He passed storefronts that had once sold shoes and hats and jewelry and hardware, their interiors now visible through gaps in the plywood where scrappers had pried the boards loose to get at the copper wiring inside. The buildings were still there, the marble facades, the brass door handles, the terracotta cornices, all still there, designed to impress shoppers who would never come again. And beyond them, visible above the rooflines to the north, the smokestacks of Gary Works rose against the sky, still producing, still burning, still making the steel that had once justified an entire city's existence. The mill had not left. It had simply stopped needing the city that had been built to serve it, the way a body might stop needing a limb, the limb still attached, still technically present, but no longer receiving the blood supply that once kept it alive. Gary, Indiana, was a city still connected to its reason for being, still bearing the name of a man who had never lived there, still wrapped in infrastructure built for a population that was never coming back. And the math, as always, was simple. 2.5 times too much city for the people who remained. The pipes still ran, the roads still cracked, the bills still came.